Advanced civilizations, it turns out, can be remarkably stupid about the most basic things. Take the Zephyrian Empire, for instance. A species that mastered faster-than-light travel, developed quantum computing arrays that could predict weather patterns across 17 star systems, and engineered weapons capable of turning entire moons into cosmic dust. Yet somehow, these technological marvels couldn't be bothered to crack open a single anthropological textbook before declaring war on humanity. The War Council chamber aboard the flagship Sovereign's Wrath hummed with the kind of artificial gravity that cost more than most planetary defense budgets. Around the crystalline conference table, Zephyrian military commanders leaned forward with the eager anticipation of predators who'd spotted wounded prey. Their chitinous exoskeletons gleamed under the ship's bioluminescent lighting, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts intimidating and, frankly, a bit overdrawn. "The intelligence reports are conclusive," announced the fleet commander, his forearms gesturing toward holographic displays showing human colony worlds. "These gatherings occur with predictable frequency across all human settlements. Large groups assemble in open areas, completely defenseless, engaged in what appears to be some form of ritualistic vulnerability display." Another officer, sporting the kind of scarred carapace that suggested either extensive combat experience or an unfortunate encounter with a particularly aggressive Daw, chimed in with obvious satisfaction. "Their military forces stand idle during these events. No defensive posturing, no tactical formations. It's almost insulting how easy they're making this for us." The assembled commanders chittered their equivalent of laughter, a sound like breaking glass having an argument with a rusty hinge. Oh, if only they knew what they were actually looking at in those surveillance feeds. But then again, cultural sensitivity had never been the Zephyrian Empire's strong suit. Their idea of diplomatic contact typically involved showing up in overwhelming force and asking pointed questions later, preferably while standing over the smoldering remains of whatever had once disagreed with them. "We strike during their next mass gathering," the fleet commander declared, his mandibles clicking with anticipation. "Maximum psychological impact, minimal resistance. These humans will learn what happens when inferior species attempt to expand into territories we've marked for conquest." The decision was made with the kind of unanimous enthusiasm typically reserved for tax cuts or free food. Not a single officer thought to question what these vulnerability displays might actually represent. Not one of them considered that perhaps, just perhaps, there might be more to human behavior than met the eye. But, then again, when you're convinced you're the apex predator in the galactic food chain, why waste time on nuance? Meanwhile, several thousand light-years away on the human colony of New Eden, the morning sun cast long shadows across the settlement's central plaza. The colonists had gathered not for some mysterious tactical weakness exhibition, but for something far more universal and profound than the Zephyrian military intelligence could have imagined. They were saying goodbye. The deceased had been the colony's chief engineer, a woman whose steady hands had kept their fusion reactors humming and their atmospheric processes running through 3 harsh winters and countless equipment failures. She had been the kind of person who could fix anything with spare parts and creative cursing, who remembered everyone's birthday, and who had somehow managed to make recycled protein taste almost like real food during the early lean years. Now she lay in a simple wooden coffin, real wood, grown in New Eden's carefully tended forests, surrounded by flowers that had been coaxed to bloom in alien soil. The entire colony had turned out, nearly 800 souls standing in respectful silence as their chaplain spoke words of comfort and remembrance. "She gave us more than her skills," the chaplain said, his voice carrying clearly across the plaza. "She gave us the gift of hope when things seemed impossible, and the knowledge that we could build something lasting here, something worth preserving." Children clutched their parents' hands, some too young to fully understand death but old enough to recognize the weight of the moment. Teenagers who usually couldn't sit still for 5 minutes stood motionless, their usual bravado replaced by something deeper. Adults who'd worked alongside the deceased for years wiped away tears, sharing quiet stories and gentle laughter as they remembered her quirks and kindnesses. It was, in short, the kind of moment that defined what made humans human. Their capacity to honor the dead, to find meaning in loss, to come together in vulnerability and find strength in shared grief. It was also, unfortunately, exactly the kind of moment that registered to alien surveillance equipment as a large, defenseless gathering with no apparent military purpose. The first sign of trouble came as a distant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Several colonists looked up, squinting against the morning sun, as they tried to identify the source of the sound. The local wildlife had gone unnaturally quiet, and even the ever-present hum of the settlement's machinery seemed muted. Then the sky began to darken. Zephyrian warships materialized out of nothing, their cloaking fields dissipating like morning mist to reveal vessels that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a deep appreciation for intimidation and a complete disregard for aerodynamic efficiency. The ships hung in the air with the casual arrogance of apex predators, their weapon arrays already beginning to glow with the distinctive blue-white light of charging particle beams. The colonists' funeral had just become something else entirely. Emergency sirens began wailing as the settlement's automated defense systems finally registered the threat, but the sound seemed pathetically inadequate against the looming alien presence. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer, while others stood frozen in shock, their minds struggling to process the sudden transformation of their solemn ceremony into a nightmare. The chaplain's voice faltered as he looked up at the alien ships, his words of comfort suddenly seeming impossibly fragile against the technological might hanging over their heads. The deceased's family huddled together beside the coffin, their grief now mixed with terror and a growing sense of outrage that their final farewell was being violated by creatures who couldn't even be bothered to understand what they were interrupting. In the lead Zephyrian vessel, tactical displays showed the human settlement laid out in perfect detail. Every building, every defensive position, every colonist standing in what the aliens interpreted as a conveniently clustered target arrangement. The fleet commander's 4 eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he studied the readings. "Perfect," he chittered to his officers. "They're maintaining their defensive stance even as we reveal ourselves. These humans are either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid." His subordinates clicked their agreement, apparently unable to recognize the third option, that the humans below were people attending a funeral who were too shocked and horrified by the sudden appearance of hostile aliens to immediately spring into tactical formations. But then again, nuance had never been the Zephyrian military's strong suit. "Begin the attack," the commander ordered, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone who'd done this many times before. "Target their gathering first. Maximum psychological impact. Once we break their morale, the rest will be simple cleanup work." The warship's weapons began to hum with increasing intensity, their targeting systems locking onto the plaza where hundreds of humans stood in stunned disbelief. In a few moments, the Zephyrian Empire would achieve what they considered a masterful tactical victory, striking at the heart of human vulnerability and demonstrating their overwhelming superiority. They had no idea they were about to make the worst mistake in their species' history. The first energy bolts lanced down from the alien ships, striking the plaza's edges and sending fountains of earth and debris into the air. The funeral was over. Now came the running, the screaming, and the beginning of something that would echo across the galaxy in ways the Zephyrian Empire couldn't possibly imagine. After all, there are some things you simply don't interrupt. And as it turned out, both species were about to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. Aboard the Sovereign's Wrath, the atmosphere was positively electric with what the Zephyrians considered tactical brilliance. The bridge crew watched their targeting displays with the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from a job well done. Never mind that the job in question involved terrorizing mourners at a funeral. Cultural sensitivity, as previously mentioned, wasn't exactly their specialty. "Excellent targeting," the fleet commander chittered, his forearms dancing across control interfaces with practiced efficiency. "Look at how they scatter. No coordinated response, no defensive formations. These humans are even weaker than our intelligence suggested." The tactical officer, a particularly scarred specimen who'd apparently earned his rank through a combination of ruthless efficiency and an unfortunate habit of stating the obvious, leaned forward eagerly. "Sir, should we target their fleeing groups?" We could achieve total psychological breakdown within minutes. Oh, the irony was thick enough to cut with a plasma blade. Here were representatives of a species that prided itself on strategic superiority, completely failing to grasp that they'd just committed what humans would consider the ultimate act of barbarism. They thought they were witnessing tactical weakness, when what they were actually seeing was shock, horror, and the kind of righteous fury that would soon make their lives considerably more complicated. The commander's mandibles clicked in what passed for Zephyrian laughter. Maintain pressure on the gathering point. Let them understand that resistance is futile. Once we break their will here, the conquest of their other colonies will proceed without significant opposition. Another officer, this one sporting the kind of pristine carapace that suggested either excellent combat luck or a talent for avoiding actual fighting, raised a claw tentatively. Commander, our intelligence reports mention these gatherings occur frequently across human settlements. Should we coordinate simultaneous strikes on other colonies during their next vulnerability displays? Brilliant thinking, the commander replied, apparently blind to the fact that what he was planning amounted to a systematic campaign of attacking funerals. We'll make this standard operating procedure. Strike when they're weakest, when they gather defenseless in the open. It's almost too easy. The bridge crew chittered their approval, no doubt envisioning the medals and commendations that would come from such tactical innovation. Not one of them paused to consider what kind of response such actions might provoke from a species that had, until this moment, been relatively peaceful neighbors. But then again, when you're convinced you're dealing with inferior beings, why worry about consequences? Down on New Eden's surface, the scene was considerably less celebratory. The colonists who'd been caught in the open during the initial attack had scattered to whatever cover they could find, their formal funeral attire now torn and dirt-stained, as they crouched behind buildings, vehicles, and anything else that might stop an energy bolt. The deceased's eldest son knelt beside an overturned memorial bench, his dress uniform jacket singed from a near miss, his face a mask of grief transformed into something harder and infinitely more dangerous. His mother's funeral had become a battlefield, her coffin now surrounded by smoking craters where alien weapons had torn apart the carefully tended plaza. They couldn't wait, he whispered to himself, his voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that suggested someone was about to make very poor decisions for very good reasons. They couldn't even wait for us to bury our dead. Nearby, the colony's security chief was already coordinating with what remained of their defensive systems, her hands flying over a portable command interface while she barked orders into her communications headset. All defensive turrets online, pattern Alpha 7, emergency broadcast to Earth Defense Command, we need immediate military support. And someone get those civilians to the underground shelters before the next wave hits. The funeral attendees were doing their best to follow evacuation procedures, but there's something uniquely disorienting about having to run for your life while dressed for a memorial service. Children who'd been standing solemnly beside their parents moments earlier were now being carried at a dead sprint toward reinforced shelters, their small faces etched with confusion and terror. The chaplain, his ceremonial robes fluttering as he helped elderly colonists to safety, kept looking back toward the plaza where the coffin still sat surrounded by destruction. 30 years of ministry, he muttered to himself, and I've never seen anything so deliberately cruel. That was the thing the Zephyrians had missed in all their tactical analysis. Humans don't just mourn their dead, they consider the act of mourning sacred. Interrupt a business meeting, and you've caused inconvenience. Interrupt a birthday party, and you've ruined someone's day. But interrupt a funeral, and you've committed an act so fundamentally violating that it transforms grief into something infinitely more dangerous. The colony's emergency broadcast reached Earth Defense Command within minutes, but the transmission that followed carried more than just tactical information and casualty reports. It carried the kind of cold fury that comes from having something precious desecrated by those too ignorant to understand what they've destroyed. Earth Defense Command, this is New Eden Colony. The security chief's voice crackled across subspace with professional calm that barely concealed seething rage. We are under attack by Zephyrian forces. They struck during Chief Engineer Thompson's funeral service. I repeat, they attacked during a funeral. 800 civilians caught in the open, including children and elderly. Requesting immediate military response. The pause that followed on the other end of the transmission lasted just long enough for the implications to sink in. Earth Defense Command had dealt with alien aggression before, but this was different. This wasn't just warfare. This was desecration. Back in orbit, the Zephyrian fleet was already preparing for the next phase of their assault, completely oblivious to the fact that they'd just crossed a line that existed in the minds of virtually every sentient species in the galaxy. The commander studied his tactical displays with the satisfaction of someone who believed he'd discovered the perfect military strategy. "Maintain orbital position," he ordered, his four arms gesturing toward the planet below. "Let them contemplate our superiority. In 6 hours we'll demand their surrender. If they refuse, we'll demonstrate what happens to species that resist the Empire." The weapons officer, eager to prove his worth, leaned forward with a suggestion that would have made military historians across the galaxy weep. "Sir, our long-range sensors detect similar gatherings scheduled on 3 other human colonies within the next standard cycle. We could coordinate strikes on all of them simultaneously." "Perfect," the commander chittered, apparently unable to recognize that he was planning what amounted to a systematic campaign of attacking funerals across human space. "We'll show them that resistance is not just futile, it's blasphemous against the natural order of Zephyrian superiority." Oh, the cosmic irony was reaching levels that would have made ancient Greek dramatists weep with envy. Here was a species so convinced of their own tactical brilliance that they were planning to make attacking funerals their signature military strategy, apparently blind to the fact that such actions might provoke responses that went well beyond conventional warfare. Meanwhile, in the deepest bunkers of New Eden Colony, emergency sessions were being held that would have significant implications for the future of human-Zephyrian relations. The colony's leadership huddled around communication arrays, their faces illuminated by the glow of screens showing tactical assessments and casualty reports. "They knew," the deputy administrator said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of tired certainty that comes from having illusions thoroughly shattered. "They had to know what they were interrupting. You don't conduct surveillance for weeks without understanding what you're looking at." The security chief shook her head grimly. "They knew, and they didn't care. Or worse, they thought it made us weaker." It was a realization that would ripple across human space in the coming hours, transforming what might have been a manageable diplomatic incident into something far more serious. The Zephyrians hadn't just attacked a human colony, they had attacked the fundamental human concept of dignity in death, the idea that there were some moments too sacred to violate, some lines too basic to cross. Above them, the alien fleet maintained its threatening orbit, its crew congratulating themselves on their tactical innovation while remaining completely oblivious to the fact that they'd just guaranteed themselves a place in military history. Though not quite the kind they were hoping for, the funeral was over, but what came next would echo across the galaxy in ways that neither species could have imagined. After all, there are some mistakes that can't be undone, and some lessons that can only be learned the hardest way possible. Sometimes the universe delivers its punchlines with the subtlety of a neutron-star collision. In this particular case, the cosmic joke was about to unfold in the sterile corridors of Earth Defense Command's Xenoanthropology Division, where a collection of academics, who normally spent their time debating the finer points of alien mating rituals, were about to stumble upon intelligence that would turn an interstellar incident into something approaching poetic justice. Dr. Martinez had been having what she generously called a perfectly terrible day, even before the emergency klaxons started wailing. Her morning had begun with a coffee machine malfunction, continued through a funding committee meeting that had questioned whether studying alien funeral practices was really necessary for galactic security, and had reached its nadir when her research assistant accidentally deleted 3 months of work on Rigelian death poetry. Then the priority alert came through, and suddenly her expertise in alien mortuary customs became the most important thing in the building. "All available xenoanthropology staff to conference room Alpha immediately," the PA system announced, with the kind of mechanical urgency that suggested someone important was having a very bad day. "Bring everything you have on Zephyrian cultural practices." Everything. Dr. Martinez grabbed her research files with the weary efficiency of someone who'd been through enough emergency briefings to know that everything really did mean everything, including the stuff that seemed completely irrelevant until it suddenly became the key to preventing galactic war. The conference room was already packed with military officers, whose expressions suggested they'd rather be planning conventional battle strategies than trying to understand alien psychology. At the head of the table, Admiral Chen looked like she'd aged 5 years in the past 2 hours, her usually immaculate uniform rumpled from what had clearly been a series of increasingly desperate meetings. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Admiral began without preamble, "we have a situation that goes beyond normal military response protocols. The Zephyrians have attacked one of our colonies during a funeral service. They've indicated this is their new standard operating procedure for dealing with what they call our vulnerability displays." Dr. Martinez felt her blood pressure spike as the implications hit her. "They're going to attack funerals? Systematically? This appears to be their plan," Admiral Chen replied grimly. "Which brings us to why you're all here. We need to understand everything about Zephyrian culture, particularly their own attitudes toward death and mourning. If we're going to respond to this, we need to know what makes them tick." The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of air recyclers and the distant sound of someone furiously typing on a datapad. Dr. Martinez opened her research files, her mind already racing through years of accumulated knowledge about Zephyrian society, searching for anything that might be relevant to their current crisis. "Well," she began slowly, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who wasn't entirely sure where her thoughts were leading. "The Zephyrians do have extensive death rituals. In fact, they're among the most elaborate in known space." A communications officer looked up from his station, with the expression of someone who'd just had an unpleasant thought. "How elaborate are we talking about, Doctor?" Dr. Martinez pulled up a holographic display, showing Zephyrian ceremonial structures, her fingers dancing across the interface as she accessed files that had seemed like academic curiosities just hours earlier. They called them mourning cycles. When a Zephyrian of significant status dies, the entire local population enters a month-long period of ritualistic grieving. They build temporary monument complexes, conduct elaborate ceremonies, and... She paused, her eyes widening as she processed the implications of what she was reading. "And?" Admiral Chen prompted, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who sensed they were about to hear something important. "And during these mourning cycles their military forces stand down, complete cessation of all aggressive activities. They consider it spiritually contaminating to engage in warfare while honoring the dead." Dr. Martinez looked up from her files, her expression a mixture of academic excitement and dawning horror. "They become completely defenseless during their own funeral periods." The silence that followed could have been packaged and sold as a tactical weapon. Every person in the room was rapidly calculating the same devastating irony. The Zephyrians had attacked a human funeral while having their own elaborate tradition of becoming militarily vulnerable during their own mourning rituals. Admiral Chen's voice, when it came, carried the kind of quiet intensity that preceded either brilliant strategies or catastrophic mistakes. "Doctor, how do we determine when their next mourning cycle is scheduled?" Dr. Martinez was already pulling up astronomical charts and Zephyrian cultural calendars, her academic training warring with the growing realization that her research was about to be used for purposes far removed from scholarly publication. "Their battle reports from the attack on New Eden mentioned casualties among their warrior caste. If those deaths were significant enough..." She paused, cross-referencing dates and cultural protocols with the kind of methodical precision that had made her career. "According to their traditions, they all begin a mourning cycle for their fallen warriors in approximately 72 hours. The ceremony will last for 28 standard days, during which their entire military apparatus will be effectively offline." The room erupted in quiet conversations as officers began calculating response times, fleet movements, and tactical possibilities. But Admiral Chen remained focused on the broader implications, her strategic mind already several moves ahead of the immediate situation. "Doctor, what would the Zephyrians consider the equivalent violation to what they did to us? What would be their ultimate cultural taboo?" Dr. Martinez consulted her files again, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "Interrupting a mourning cycle would be considered the greatest possible sacrilege in their culture. It would be seen as not just military aggression, but spiritual contamination of the highest order. They believe that disturbing the dead brings curses upon entire bloodlines, so if we were to attack their ceremonial sites during their mourning cycle, it would be exactly equivalent to what they did to us. Dr. Martinez finished quietly. Perhaps worse, given how elaborate their death rituals are compared to our relatively simple funeral services. Admiral Chen leaned back in her chair, her expression cycling through various emotions before settling on something that looked remarkably like grim satisfaction. Gentlemen, ladies, I believe we've found our response strategy. Dr. Martinez, I need everything you have on Zephyrian ceremonial sites, ritual timing, and cultural vulnerabilities. We're going to give them a lesson in the consequences of desecrating the dead. The orders went out within hours, carried by encrypted transmissions to fleet commanders across human space. The message was simple and devastating in its implications. Prepare for Operation Reflection, a coordinated strike on Zephyrian ceremonial sites during their upcoming mourning cycle. It was, the planners noted with a certain academic appreciation for irony, exactly the kind of culturally sensitive response that the situation demanded. The Zephyrians had attacked humans during their most vulnerable and sacred moments, apparently unable to comprehend that such actions might have consequences beyond simple military retaliation. Soon, they would understand that lesson in the most direct way possible. Earth Defense Fleet. Admiral Thompson, no relation to the deceased engineer whose funeral had started this entire mess, but sharing enough of a name to make the irony even more pointed, received his orders while his battle group was conducting routine patrols near the Centauri system. His response to the briefing was everything the situation required, and nothing it didn't. Understood, Command. We'll show them exactly what they've done, and we'll do it during their most sacred time. Sometimes the best way to teach cultural sensitivity is through practical demonstration. The fleet began moving towards Zephyrian space with the kind of purposeful coordination that comes from having a clear mission and unambiguous moral authority. They weren't just going to war, they were going to deliver a lesson in the consequences of attacking Furus. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, Zephyrian long-range sensors detected the movement of human fleet assets toward their territory. The intelligence was passed up the chain of command with the casual efficiency of a military apparatus that had no idea it was about to experience its own cultural violation on a scale that would resonate through their society for generations. The cosmic joke was approaching its punchline, and neither species was quite prepared for how perfectly, terribly appropriate it was going to be. The human fleet arrived at Zephyrian space with impeccable timing, exactly as the Empire's most sacred mourning cycle commenced across their homeworld. Crystalline monuments stretched toward alien skies, while millions of Zephyrians gathered in reverent silence, honoring their fallen warriors with elaborate rituals that had remained unchanged for millennia. Then human warships decloaked directly above their ceremonial sites. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. Zephyrian mourners scattered in terror as energy bolts struck the sacred monuments, shattering thousand-year-old traditions along with the crystalline structures. Their military forces, bound by religious law to remain inactive during mourning cycles, could only watch helplessly as their most holy ceremonies became battlefields. Fleet Commander Vex experienced the same shock and outrage his species had inflicted on New Eden, his four arms trembling as he witnessed the desecration of everything his culture held sacred. The realization hit like a plasma torpedo to the thorax. This was exactly what they had done to the humans. Within hours, emergency diplomatic channels crackled with Zephyrian surrender offers and frantic apologies. The war that might have consumed both species ended not with overwhelming force, but with a simple lesson in empathy, delivered at precisely the right moment. Both civilizations learned that grief transcends species, and that some violations echo across the universe until justice finds its perfect, terrible balance.